Group policy provides a means to create rules that enable you to manage users' computers and other objects stored in Active Directory. Group policy applies configuration settings that your organization wishes to enforce. These settings are pushed out to targeted groups of users or computers. Standard users cannot modify a managed setting, which means that once you've created a policy to enforce a particular setting, if the user gained access to a management tool on their local computer, they couldn't change that setting. So, for instance, you might use Windows Update, or you might use group policy to configure Windows Update settings, and then a user couldn't go into settings on their Windows 10 computer and change the way Windows Update was applied. Group policy objects, or GPOs, are collections of settings. When you create a group policy object and configure the settings, you apply these to container objects. You do not apply them to user or computer objects directly. Rather, you place user and computer objects into the appropriate container, such as a site, a domain, or an OU, and you then apply the GPO settings to that container, thereby applying them to the contained users and computers. Commonly applied group policy settings will include folder redirection, the ability to redirect your desktop or your documents folders. By default, of course, those folders are accessed locally in the c:/users/username folder. But in a networked environment, when users move between computers, it might be desirable for them to be able to access their documents folder from wherever they sit. So folder redirection provides a means to do that. You can use group policy to deploy software. It's not necessarily the best way of deploying software, but it's certainly possible. By deploying software, I mean you can have it install line of business applications, which are desktop apps rather than Microsoft Store apps. You configure a script to run at startup or shutdown, or log in or log out. These scripts can be using a variety of different scripting languages, including VBScript and PowerShell. These might do things like map a network drive, or configure the user environment, or display a message in a given situation. You can apply security templates. So security templates that you perhaps have created in a test network, which you now wish to apply to your organization's network. It might include things like user account control settings, or password expiration, and other security policy details. Group policy preferences is a way of you configuring a preferred setting, but not preventing a user necessarily from changing that setting. So group policy settings themselves cannot be edited by users, but group policy preferences can be. When you want to manage group policies, you have a number of tools. The Group Policy Management Console allows you to view the hierarchy of your organization in terms of forests and domains and organizational units. You can also take a look at the group policy objects and see which containers they're linked to. The Group Policy Management Editor allows you to edit the contents of a group policy to configure the specific settings that you want to apply to your organization. You can do the equivalent of all of that through Windows PowerShell commandlets. Let's take a look at how to create a group policy object, how to configure some common group policy object settings, and then how to apply those settings to a client computer. Okay, a very common administrative task to perform is to configure group policies. There are a number of tools that are provided for this. Scroll down to Windows Administrative Tools and locate Group Policy Management. Now, the Group Policy Management tool allows you to view the existing group policies and the containers to which they are assigned, and to do things such as modeling and verifying the application of group policies using the results tool, GP results tool. Let's give myself a bit more working room here. If I expand out forest, pearson.com, and domains, pearson.com, we can see a similar view to what we saw in Active Directory users and computers in the earlier demonstration. There, for example, is the sales object. We don't see any users listed. That's not really relevant here. We apply group policies to containers, not individual users. There are a list of group policy objects, 2 by default domain controllers policy, which applies to the domain controllers container, which itself contains the domain controller computer objects. So in other words, the policies settings that you configure to the default domain controllers policy will apply to domain controllers because they are stored in the object to which this policy applies. Likewise, there's a default domain policy which is automatically applied to the domain, and so any computers or users that are members of the domain will have the settings in that policy applied. So to create a group policy, we right-click the group policy objects and say New. Another alternative is to right-click the object, in this case the domain, right-click the domain object and say Create a GPO in this domain and link it here. So we're doing two things in one step. We're creating a group policy and immediately applying it to the object to which it will ultimately apply. So I'll go down that route. I'm going to create a group policy object in this domain and link it to the domain. I'm going to call this test. I won't talk about source starters, that's getting a bit detailed really. So click OK. Here is my test group policy object. It contains nothing at the moment. So to configure settings on it, I need to right click it and choose Edit, and that opens up another management tool called the Group Policy Management Editor tool. Now, although I briefly mentioned in passing that group policies apply to containers and not to specific users or computers, that's not entirely true. Well, I mean, it is true. We apply them to containers, but the containers contain computer and user objects. So by implication, because a user exists in a particular container and the container has a policy applied to it, then in effect, the policy settings apply to user objects. The distinction is worth making here because some settings affect only the user element of a sign-in. So when you sign in at a computer, your desktop color scheme and wallpaper and some of your application settings and so on are part of your user configuration. So if a different user signs in, they will experience different settings. But some of the settings apply to the computer irrespective of who's actually signed in at that computer. This becomes quite important when you start to look at group policies because you can configure group policies to apply settings to the computer, irrespective of who's signed in, or to the user, or to both. So let's expand out the policy settings here, and you can see for both computer and user there are software settings that allows us to deploy software. We'll maybe cover that later. Windows settings, which deals with things like startup and shutdown scripts or log on and log off scripts, settings for printers, security settings, and so on. And likewise, down here, some of the QoS and security settings that we can configure, which would apply to the user object, irrespective of which computer they were sitting at. And folder redirection settings, which again we will talk about later. Under administrative templates, we have a huge number of additional policy settings that we could configure. For example, to control the start menu and taskbar layout and behavior, to control Windows components like, if I scroll down here, the way that Windows Update behaves. As a network administrator, probably most of the changes that you will make are likely to be in the computer configuration area. So, for example, you may well reconfigure security settings, account policies. As you see here, the password policy, the account lockout policy, local policies in terms of the audit policy, user rights, what people can do in other words, and specific security options. You may enable and configure event logs for accessing content in the event viewer. And then down here under control panel settings, you may configure personalization. So force a specific default lock screen and logon image, you can do that. You may decide to configure Windows components, which I mentioned just a moment ago. So configure the way that Windows Update behaves. If I open up Windows Update, there are a lot of settings here that pertain to Windows Update. So we can configure, for example, automatic updates. If I double click that, we can specify the settings. And actually, maybe now's a good time to show you how typically settings apply. Generally, a setting is either not applied, as is the case here, it's not configured, in which case the setting doesn't do anything, or it's disabled, which means in this case configure automatic updates is turned off. So in other words, we're not going to configure automatic updates. Or we enable a setting. Sometimes that's all you can do. You either enable it or you disable it from its default setting if not configured. But in this instance, once we've enabled a setting, we can go on to configure some additional characteristics of the fact that it's enabled. In this instance, we can say notify for download and auto install. So that might be a setting where when you've got an update, the user is notified that they can download and auto install the update. The alternative is to auto-download and then notify the user that it's ready for installation, or auto-download and schedule the install without informing the user. So there are a variety of additional settings. And then there are supplemental settings down here. Precisely what you can configure depends on what it is that you're configuring. So if we go to something like, I don't know, the personalization option we looked at earlier on, prevent changing lock screen and log on image, if I double click that one, for example, that's either not configured, the default setting, in other words, we go by what the local setting is on that particular computer, or it's enabled, or it's turned off. So there's nothing else to configure down here. But once you've configured the various settings that you want, you close your Group Policy Management Editor, and we're in a situation then when the changes are stored in this object here. In this instance, this is the Group Policy object itself. So you've configured settings, but they're residing here. So how do they come to apply to a particular user or computer? Well, the answer is once an object, a Group Policy object, is linked to a container, in this case to the domain, any user or computer that's part of that container, and that's everything, I guess, in this instance, the settings will apply. Now, they will be refreshed automatically on a periodic basis. Sometimes, when you've made a change, the user needs to sign in or rather sign out and sign back in again to see the effect of the change. Sometimes the user might need to restart their computer and then sign in for them to see the change. But the change is automatically refreshed on a 60-minute to 120-minute basis. But we can force that using a number of different tools. Let's take a look. So I'm going to open up a command prompt. I'll run it elevated. The first thing to do is to do a gp update /force. That will force the group policy objects that apply to this computer and to this user to be refreshed. Now remember, although the settings are refreshed, and that means the local registry and related settings are updated, it doesn't necessarily mean you'll see the change. It might require that the user does a sign out, sign in, or the computer is restarted. But as you can see here, the policies have both been refreshed. As I said, that would happen automatically normally. We can also use a tool called GP Result. If we use the switch here, /R, it will tell us a bit more about what's going on. It displays a resultant policy report. Let's have a look at that. And if we scroll back up here, it will tell us, okay, it's a member workstation. It's in a site called default first site name. The local profile is administrator. It's not connected over a slow link, which may have a bearing on what settings apply. The applied group policy objects are the default domain policy. The local group policy isn't being applied because it's empty. And it tells us that the computer is a part of the following security groups. Then we've got user settings. A bit of a summary here again. Applied group policy objects, there are none. And a summary of which groups this particular user belongs to. You can even see that in a HTML file. So it's created a test.html file. If I switch to Explorer here and click on my documents. Oops, okay, let's go and do it this way. Users, administrator. There's my test file. If I double click that, well, it'll open up. It tries to open up in Edge. Let's open it up in Internet Explorer. So here we can see a summary in a more digestible format, I suppose. We can see that everything worked okay, there were no problems. And we can scroll down and we can see which particular settings are applying. So we see here that enforced password history is enabled, 24 passwords are remembered, and that's been achieved through the use of the default domain policy. It's very handy to know exactly where the particular settings are coming from. So that's using the GP Result tool. In the demonstration, you saw how to create a group policy object, how to configure settings within the GPO, and how to apply those settings.